Makahanya haramita shingyo Genji Saiboza Gyojin Hanya haramita Jishoken Gon Gai Guro Esai Gu Yaku Shari Shiki.
The Bull Herding Pictures. Picture number 2. Finding the Traces. Reading the Sutras and listening to the teachings, the herdsman had an inkling of their message and meaning. He has discovered the traces. Now he knows that however varied and manifold, yet all things are of the one gold, and that his own nature does not differ from that of any other. But he cannot yet distinguish between what is genuine and what is fake, still less between the true and the false. He can thus not enter the gate, and only provisionally can it be said that he has found the traces. So we continue now with our series of talks on the 10 bull herding pictures, the classic spiritual allegory of the training, of the Zen training. Originally, these pictures were created in medieval China. These particular pictures are a Japanese rendition done a little bit later by Shubun in the 1500s in Japan, but they're said to faithfully reproduce the originals. And here we are at picture number 2, Finding the Traces. And it seems like not much has changed really from picture number 1. We still just see our herdsman. There's no bull visible yet. What we have is still a wilderness, a landscape. We can see the mountains in the distance. There's a forest over to the right-hand side. But actually there has been a change, because if we look at the herdsman, we can see that he's actually changed his posture. In the first picture, if you remember, his feet were pointing in one direction and he was actually looking over his shoulder in another. And this was this state of split consciousness that we find ourselves in very much. We're sort of looking about a little bit aimlessly, and he looked a bit aimless. And in our day-to-day experience, this is very much how we are, of course, being pulled about one way and the other. And certainly if we look at ourselves physically and mentally, we find ourselves in this split state. On the one hand, our bodies are doing one thing, maybe walking down the street, but in our minds we are in 1,000 other places. And this is the split state. This is the very opposite of that term samadhi, which means a joining together or a oneness. And this is why our practice, of course, is continuously this wholehearted giving of myself back into what at this moment is being done. In other words, healing that split by that wholehearted giving of myself. And this is also why in Zen practice as well, there is a very strong physical component. Because when we're engaged in physical work, particularly if it's quite heavy physical work, there's very little room to be ghosting around in the thoughts too much. The more urgent it is, and particularly if it's a little bit precarious, the more we have to actually come together. I remember Venerable Myokyo-ni once saying that the monks at Daitokaji at one point they would be pounding some rice which they had had to form into a form of dough, and one held the pestle above, and instead of grinding, normally with a pestle and mortar, you be grinding the pestle into the mortar. This was a sort of pum 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 like thrusting down movement, and the second monk would be kneeling, and in between the pestle coming down, he would have to pick up the dough and turn it over, or turn it round 90 degrees. And of course it requires absolutely 100% concentration, 100% real giving of myself. Otherwise, you may get your fingers crushed. Remarkably, she said, or perhaps not so remarkably, she said no one ever did get their fingers crushed. And this is very much because when we know that something is violently urgent in that way, we are extremely careful. I always remember being quite surprised by the statistic that when they built the Empire State Building in the early 20th century, that despite the fact that they didn't have all the safety harnesses that we have now, only 2 people died in its construction of all the many hundreds that worked on it and climbed up it, and one of them died from a heart attack, not from falling off the building. People know, when we know that there is danger, then the body automatically becomes 100% collected together, and that samadhi happens quite naturally. And this is an interesting point, because that samadhi does happen quite naturally. And even during our ordinary day, we will enter into samadhi. It's just that we're not aware of it. In fact, I remember, again, there are 3 types of situation where that samadhi will happen quite naturally, and that process of really being given in to the situation occurs. One is if it's something that I really want to do. So, for example, if it's a book that I'm fascinated in, or a talk that I'm fascinated in, or if it's a hobby of some sort that I really enjoy, then quite naturally I will give myself into it. The second is, as has already been pointed out, is if it's urgent or it's an emergency, then again, quite naturally, I will just hand myself over into those circumstances, and the split will be healed. And the third one is if there's simply no other option. And I remember when I was revising for my O-levels, as they were called then, I had to revise European history, which really didn't interest me, and so I left it to the very end, the very last minute before the exam. And I would pick up the book and I would start reading, and my eyes would grow heavy and I would feel tired, but I had to persist. So I would read a page and realize I hadn't taken any of it in at all, but I had no option. I had to do it, and I didn't want to fail the exam. So I would really begin to apply myself. And it was remarkable, actually. After a very short period of time, suddenly it was almost like getting over a sort of hump in the road. The inertia would just be overcome, and suddenly a momentum would come. And I'd suddenly think, oh my goodness, this is actually quite interesting. This now ties in with that, and that comes together, and this explains why that happened, and so forth. And by the end of it, I'd sort of think, well, actually, that wasn't so bad. Now, I'm going to keep that going, when we go back into the ordinary term. Of course, after the exam was over, the holidays, the new term starts, and the usual interests begin to take over. History recedes into the distance, and we start all over again, and we come to the exam, and I would still leave it to the last minute before revising again. But so sometimes we just don't learn. I certainly didn't in that situation, and what a pity, because there was a real secret. There was a real secret that whatever I give my heart into comes alive. And this is where we begin to find our herdsman as well. There he is on that road. We may not be able to see it terribly clearly, but if you just look at the bit of road in front of his feet, you'll see there are some markings. These are the hoof prints of the bull. And now, having come together, he's begun to see these hoof prints. Now, we remind ourselves, of course, that the herdsman is not I. The herdsman represents our human nature. And the bull represents that tremendous but very elemental and untamed heart energy. For a long time, that energy has not been seen in its own right. It's not been seen as autonomous and elemental. It's simply been seen as mine. It's my anger, my wants, my opinions, what I think should happen and what I will not put up with, and all the rest of it. And all these things are personalized. And of course, in the training, we begin to see ourselves in a less personal way, a more impersonal, and we begin to recognize this force that is in us. But at the moment, it's too strong. It comes up and it carries me away. But at least now, as we begin looking at that preface here on the Finding the Traces, we begin reading the sutras and listening to the teachings. The herdsman has an inkling of their message and meaning. And this is, of course, why we do familiarize ourselves with the Buddha's teachings, because what they are, of course, is a map, but also we could liken them to a different pair of spectacles, different to the usual way that I see myself, my situation, my problems, etc. And this is useful because, to be honest, if we're looking into the Buddha Dharma in order to help us genuinely, because we feel that either I've got a particular problem that I want to solve, or even if it's just something far vaguer than that, somehow that something's missing in my life, then my old way of seeing, my old way of going about things, my old attitude, we could say, isn't working. There's something missing, there's something deficient. And so this is why we've now begun to look around maybe we've tried philosophy, maybe we've tried one or two other things, but now we've sort of come to the Buddha's teachings, and here something sort of seems to ring a bell, something seems to resonate for us, and hence we've become interested and we begin to explore further. And we may be thinking at this point, well, wait a minute, having read something about Zen, didn't Bodhidharma, in that verse that's ascribed to him, say a special transmission outside the teachings, not dependent on words and phrases? Doesn't that mean we don't need the teachings? No, it doesn't mean that at all. What it means is that we are not dependent on the words and phrases to save us. And it's right, just reading the sutras and listening to the teachings, these things alone do not save us. If that's all we do, then we are armchair Zen Buddhists. And in the end, when something really serious happens to us, I lose my job, my relationship breaks up, the doctor says that he's got some bad news for me, something like that, then just listening to a few talks and so forth, that will not make me feel better. That will not save me. The Buddha's teachings are to be applied, not just believed in. And if we remember that Bodhidharma himself was, according to legend, brought over the Lankavatara Sutra, one of the great Mahayana sutras connected with the Yogacara school, from India to China. Now, he would not have done that if the teachings were not important. And the Buddha, obviously, also gave all his teachings. That's where the teachings originate from. He would not have done that either unless they were of importance to us. So we need to be familiar with these teachings. And interestingly, it's not just the case that now we go in and we learn the Noble Eightfold Path in its original Pali and think that that's going to do it. It's not about that. It's about, first of all, familiarizing ourselves with the teaching, and then we start the practice. We start a meditation practice, but most importantly, we start a daily life practice, what's sometimes called a mindfulness practice. But unless we've got that lens, unless we've got that comparator, and this is what the Buddha's teachings are, they give us suggestions, they give us a way of taking the raw data that we are collecting together through the practice and begin to see it through the eyes of the Buddha Dharma instead of seeing it through my eyes. Because otherwise a mindfulness practice simply falls back, or a daily life practice simply comes back to me again, and it's all about me, and it's I have these feelings and I want to get rid of this about my personality, and I want to accumulate that about my personality, and even I want enlightenment and all this sort of thing. I don't even know what enlightenment is, but I imagine I do. And so, because it's a word that has no real meaning for me, I can paint it with all my heavenly colours, whatever my imagination can paint and whatever it can actually create. But this doesn't help me, because it's just another picture of me. Maybe a fancier picture of me, but it's still a picture of me. And if that was sufficient, then we wouldn't be looking at Buddhism. We would be able to solve our own problems on our own. It's precisely because there's something in my attitude towards myself and my life that is missing, that I look elsewhere. So, reading the sutras and listening to the teachings, the herdsman has an inkling of their message and meaning. He has discovered the traces, and this is the stage we are at here. And this is a well-known stage. In fact, even in the early teachings, there's what's known as the triple wisdom: Shruta, Chinta, Bhavana. Shruta, which means literally hearing with the ear, though more to our present circumstances. We may also say reading with the eye as well. Then there's Chinta, which means pondering in the heart. So, having heard those teachings, having read that book, or we begin to ponder it. Somehow, this is where, as it were, the heart and the outer teachings begin to come together, and there's a sort of click of some sort, a resonance. And then the third part, of course, is bhavana. Bhavana is a word that's sometimes used to translate as meditation. Quite literally, it means cultivation. Bhava means becoming. And it usually refers to the ripening of karmic seeds from the past to form a new rebirth in the future. So it's that form of becoming. But bhavana actually means, so to speak, directed becoming. So directed becoming is akin to development or cultivation. And this is again what we have with this chap here in the picture, because his body and his head and his hand and his feet are all now pointing in the one direction. He's no longer uncertain. He's no longer riven by doubt. He knows that this is the path he's got to go. He's seen the traces of the bull, and he's clearly going in that direction. So already his discipline is cultivated to the point where he now will not be distracted quite so easily, at least consciously anyway. So in this way we can say he has discovered those traces of the bull. Now he knows that however varied and manifold, yet all things are of the one gold. Now, this of the one gold, this really takes us back to the enlightenment of the Buddha. In the northern tradition, in the Nirvana Sutra, it is said that on his awakening, the Buddha declared, "How wonderful, how miraculous! All beings, but all beings, are fully and completely endowed with the wisdom and the power of the Tathagata," the Tathagata being another name of the Buddha. In other words, he was declaring the Buddha nature, and what became known as the Buddha nature, that all beings have the Buddha nature, and that this Buddha nature is equal and even in all beings, whether we're looking at Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, or whether we're just looking at ordinary people like you and me. Presumably there's Buddhas are off doing what Buddhas do, not listening to this talk right now. However, the Buddha nature is equal and even in all beings. And this is what this one gold is here. Now he knows that however varied and manifold, yet all things are of the one gold, and that his own nature does not differ from that of any other. Master Torre, who was a great pupil of the great reformer Master Hakuin, says that in his book, in his treatise on the inexhaustible lamp, says that the first article of faith in Zen Buddhism is a deep root of faith that all beings have the Buddha nature and that it can be realized too. And without that, we simply have no motivation to go on this path, difficult as it can be sometimes. So this is an article of faith. To begin with, we have to take it on trust. And it's fair enough. We can read the teachings, we can read the accounts of the patriarchs and those who've gone before, and we see that they've attained, and we're impressed by that, and so we know it's possible. And if they can do it and they say that we can do it, then we can trust that. Otherwise, we wouldn't go for the teachings in the first place. So until we've have some experience of our own and begun to recognize this, the functioning of the Buddha nature, and the bull and the Buddha nature, of course, are very closely connected. If we remember the passions of the Buddha nature is the passions, and the bull represents, it personifies those elemental impulses, as has already been said, then we can see that that connection is there. We get to know one, and in the same way we get to know the other too. And we need to be careful when we look at these terms, because when we talk about the one nature, this is not the same as saying that everything is the same. And this is now very important. And in places like India, and certainly in China, which is where Chan, later Zen, in the Japanese, arose, this idea of nature is extremely important. Its native religion, Taoism, also has this great sense of that nature, the inherent principle within things, is not only one through all beings, but is naturally harmonious as well between things. And hearing about this one, as I said, we need to be clear what it actually means, because we look around us and we see a great deal of diversity, and it certainly doesn't look to my eye that things are the same, and of course they're not. Their forms certainly do vary, but the inherent nature is the same. And perhaps as a sort of a simile for this, if we imagine an oak tree in the height of summer, when all its leaves are unfurled, I mean on a giant oak tree, there must be thousands of leaves there. The interesting thing is that no two leaves are the same. Yet, if you take any single one of them, each one of them is clearly and identifiably an oak leaf. So here we also have something that is now of the one nature, that is, that they are all share the nature of being an oak leaf, and yet they are all quite different from each other, all quite unique. And it's the same with humanity as well. We share our human nature. That's the thing that binds us. Yet within that human nature, we have male and female. We have people from the south and people from the north, people east and people west. And even if we take, for example, people from the west, we have some who are taller, some who are shorter, some who've got blue eyes, some who have brown, and so on and so forth, until we come right the way down to the individuals. So, depending on our perspective, we have that one nature at one end, and we also have difference at the other. So this is something that, from an I point of view, is quite difficult to really get my head around, because that basic split into I and other always infects our perceptions. If we think, for example, in some schools they have what's known as the metta practice. That's the practice of goodwill, sometimes called loving kindness, and one starts with with the people that one knows close to one's friends and family, and then gradually you begin to, and one feels the metta towards them, and then gradually one begins to go further away to acquaintances, to work colleagues, etc., and then gradually you begin to take in people that I actively don't like, etc. And of course, I can't. Something rails against that. I think, no, they're not part of my group at all. But it takes a long time to really recognize that mutual humanity in all beings. Why? Because some people are against me. There really are people out there who would happily see the worst things happen to me. There's no doubt about that. Yet, despite that, we share the same humanity. But of course, the emotional response isn't conditioned like that. The emotional response is conditioned towards the personal and I. The Bodhisattva and the Buddhas, they are the ones whose compassion is universal. We're all capable of compassion. And we're all capable of goodwill. We're all capable of being happier for others too. But only to those people who I feel really deserve it. And it's that but only to. That's a very typical I-based word. My vision, my attitude, is to paint the world into those two colours, black and white, or in-group and out-group. Our emotional household is very much conditioned to do that. Now he knows that however varied and manifold, yet all things are of the one gold, and that his own nature does not differ from that of any other. But he cannot yet distinguish between what is genuine and what is fake, still less between the true and the false. Well, being able to distinguish between the genuine and the fake, yes, and that's important. Here we are. I mean, the internet's a wonderful thing, but there's a lot of information out there. Some of it's good, some of it's not so good. So how can we distinguish between what is genuine and what is fake? And we don't really have to look very far before we see, for example, all the effects of, and particularly in the world of religion and spirituality, every other year there's some kind of horror story of some cult has gone suicidal or has exploited its followers and what else. And yet these people are really devastated at the end. They were genuinely looking for something and they really felt that they had found it. And of course, because I want something so much, I can tend to turn a blind eye to the obvious signs of things. And then there's the other side, of course. There's those who are so suspicious about anything to do with religion, particularly nowadays. People like the term spirituality. They don't like the term religion very much. I think that's part of the reason also why people like to think that Buddhism isn't a religion, though people in Buddhist countries might be surprised to hear that, because religion, I don't like it. I'm suspicious of it, sort of a priori. And so I won't give myself to it, or I'll only give myself to it, to the bits of it that I agree with. I remember hearing a Tibetan Lama who had taught in Tibet and also taught for many years in England as well. And he said that the difference between a Tibetan and an English person or British person as a student, he said, is that if a Tibetan student comes to him and says that he wishes to learn, say, Vajrayana, and he says, okay, well, first you need to do this and that and the other, they will go away and do it. Whereas if you say to a British person, right, I'd like to, and they say they'd like to learn Vajrayana, and you say, okay, first you need to do this, and then you need to do that, they'll come back and say, oh, I'm not so sure about that. I don't mind this, but I'm not so sure about that. And he laughed and said, it's very funny. He said, they come to you because they want to know, and when you tell them, they don't bother. If it doesn't suit them, then they go away. They won't actually try it. And I have to say, when I heard that, my own experience is very, very similar. People will often come and say, well, I'd like to learn Zen and working with the bull and so forth, and then give an instruction, and people say, anything else? It's rather like those. I remember seeing a cartoon of Hagar the Horrible, It used to be a cartoon in a newspaper many years ago. Hagar being a Viking with a sort of horned hat and the whole thing. Anyway, he's up a mountain and he's in the snowy wastes there. He meets a sort of one of the mountain hermits, and he said, "I am searching for enlightenment. I am searching for wisdom. Can you help me?" And the mountain hermit says, "Yes, you must practice abstinence, and you must practice poverty, and you must practice obedience." And Hagar says, He said, "Anyone else up here I can talk to?" He cannot yet distinguish between what is genuine and what is fake, still less between the true and the false. And the true and the false actually refers not to others, but to oneself, one's own thoughts, one's own motivations. Still, although we know about the bull, actually he still manages to drag me along. I still, when my temper is lost, anything to do with Buddhism flies out of the window, and I'm now making my stand once again on my opinion, and to hell with all the rest. So it takes a long time before, in the moment, we really can distinguish the machinations and the movements of the bull. So for a long time still, that bull completely eludes me. He can thus not enter the gate, and only provisionally can it be said that he has found the traces. And that gate, of course, is a famous symbol in Zen. It appears later on as well at the end of this, in the 10th picture. And we may have even come across the gate, because there's a famous text called the Mumonkan, which is Mumon being a famous master, but it's also translated, which is a collection of koans, but it's also called the Gateless Gate. And this is the gate that appears to exist. This is the barrier that appears to exist, but actually is not there. So we come to the end of our preface, finding the traces. Just now, Herdsman, there's an important difference. The bull isn't yet visible, of course. That's important.